If you were prospecting for gold or silver in Colorado in the second half of the 19th century, you would have found a lot more than gold and silver. The unspoiled scenic splendor of Colorado makes you wonder if finding precious metals wasn't an excuse for these early prospectors to leave their families and friends for the solitude of mountain life. For almost 20 years, a cowboy from Kentucky and a carpenter from Indiana worked independently, looking for precious metals in Colorado without any success. The cowboy, Bob Womack, spent his time prospecting the southwestern side of Pikes Peak, certain the float he discovered in Cripple Creek would lead him to a rich gold vein. The carpenter, Winfield Scott Stratton, had spent his winters as a carpenter in Colorado Springs, saving up his money for prospecting during the summer months. He had prospected in every corner of Colorado without success, and after 17 years of futility, was a discouraged and bitter man. Only because of his friendship for the cowboy Bob Womack did Stratton agree to ride to Cripple Creek in May of 1891 to check out an ancient volcanic crater that Womack was certain contained gold. The gold that Womack discovered would eventually make more than 30 people millionaires, save the United States economy after the silver crash of '93, and create the wildest of all western towns in that era, in the city of Cripple Creek. The Cripple Creek Mining District became one of the top 5 greatest gold-producing districts in the world. At the height of the district's gold production, the town of Cripple Creek was the 4th largest city in Colorado, with more than 35,000 people, 27 saloons, 300 sporting ladies, and 72 attorneys. The story of Cripple Creek is the story of fortunes made and lost. It is the story of a carpenter who became one of the richest men in the country, but was unable to find any happiness in his wealth. It is the story of a cowboy who discovered this famous bowl of gold, but never made more than a few $100s from his original claim. The story of Cripple Creek is the story of a young country rediscovering itself in the West after a bloody civil war and emerging into the 20th century enriched from its natural resources as the strongest nation in the world. Cattle rancher Levi Welty and his 3 sons decided to find a better location for their ranch in El Paso County after the founding of Colorado Springs in 1871. The new town was making ranching difficult, and Levi decided to investigate the west side of Pikes Peak for raising his cattle. In what is now the town of Cripple Creek, Levi and his sons found a perfect valley with a small stream, an ideal location for their ranch. Concerned about wild animals fouling their stream, the Weltys built a small shack over the spring that was a source of their water supply. While building the shack, a log rolled on one of Levi's sons and injured him. While running to help his son, Levi accidentally discharged his gun and injured his hand. Their pet calf was startled by the gunshot and tried to jump over the stream, breaking its leg while it tried to escape. With everyone injured and groaning in pain, Levi was claimed to have said, "Well, boys, this is sure some Cripple Creek." It wasn't until the gold rush of 1891 that Edward de la Verne suggested their discovery should be named after the small stream and created the Cripple Creek Mining District. Bob Womack was born in Kentucky in 1844. He came out to Colorado at the age of 17 with his father Sam in 1861 to search for gold and silver in the Colorado mountains, and also to avoid conscription in the Union Army. His father had modest success looking for silver in the Leadville area and saved over $10,000 from his efforts. With his health failing, Sam decided to settle his family on a cattle ranch in El Paso County on the banks of Fountain Creek. Eventually, the Womack family purchased the Welty homestead, and Bob moved to the west side of Pikes Peak to help the family with their new cattle ranch. The confirmed bachelor built a small shack on their property and called his new home Poverty Gulch. Bob loved living in the mountains and was delighted that he could now pursue his 2 loves, being a ranching cowboy, and looking for gold. In May of 1878, Bob found a float in Cripple Creek that contained gold. He knew that if he could find the source of this outcropping, he would probably find a rich gold vein. For the next 12 years, Bob worked his way back up the stream looking for the source of his float. During that time, Bob did his best to convince the people of Colorado Springs that there was gold on the west side of Pikes Peak. But nobody believed Bob, and they had two very good reasons not to. The first reason was because Bob loved to drink whiskey, and when he wasn't being a cowboy or looking for gold, Bob was carousing in the wild saloons of old Colorado City. The second reason was the Mount Pisgah hoax. In 1884, a few business owners of Canyon City perpetrated a hoax that there was gold on the west side of Pikes Peak. The extra business from the curious prospectors was the only gold anyone found. This hoax made the people of Colorado Springs very skeptical about any new claims, and they laughed at Bob and his tales of gold. But the discovery of gold at Cripple Creek may never have happened if Bob Womack didn't need to see a dentist about a toothache. There are many monumental events that have affected the history of our great country. But who would have ever imagined that something as insignificant as Bob Womack's toothache would have such an impact on the history of the western United States? Dr. John Grannis was a modest Colorado Springs dentist who had a great passion for science. Dr. Grannis listened with great interest to Bob Womack's mantra about gold on the western slope of Pikes Peak while he was filling one of Bob's cavities. Dr. Grannis was well aware of Bob's reputation as a drunk, but he was intrigued by Bob's story and decided to investigate it for himself. So Dr. Grannis arranged a meeting with geology professor Dr. Lamb at Colorado College in Palmer Hall and tried to learn as much as he could about the nature of gold. There were many theories on how gold was formed, and one of them suggested gold came from the center of the earth, brought up through volcanic activity. The area that Bob told Dr. Grannis contained gold just so happened to be in the crater of an extinct volcano. This volcanic crater was later referred to as the Bowl of Gold. Because of that information, Dr. Grannis decided to grubstake Bob Womack $500 for half interest in any gold claims he found. Bob finally had a respected person to give him credibility, and it had an amazing effect on his self-confidence. Bob redoubled his efforts to find gold, and on October 20th, 1890, he filed his first claim for the El Paso lode. 12 years after finding that first float in Cripple Creek, now a middle-aged man at the age of 46, Bob Womack finally found his gold mine. Some of the samples assayed over $250 a ton, and the so-called Cripple Creek gold rush began with a whimper. Hard rock mining was a very expensive business back in 1890, and Bob Womack and Dr. Grannis faced many obstacles. Even though they had a legitimate gold claim, it was very difficult to convince the moneyed people of Colorado Springs to believe that they had found an actual gold mine, let alone to invest in it. And their claim was virtually worthless without the money needed to develop it into an actual mine. It wasn't until 4 months later they were finally able to convince a respected mining expert, Edward de la Verne, to check out their claim. They knew if they could convince de la Verne of the legitimacy of their claim, the rest of the respectable people in Colorado Springs might be interested in investing in it. In January of 1891, de la Verne traveled up to Cripple Creek to see for himself. He was not disappointed. With de la Verne involved, the Colorado Springs Gazette decided to run a story on the discovery of gold. The Cripple Creek Gold Rush finally had the credible publicity it needed to get started. On April 5, 1891, a meeting was held at the Broken Box Ranch on the site of the original Welty homestead to create the Cripple Creek Mining District. Frank Costello, Bob Womack, Edward de la Verne, Fred and Claire Frisbee, George and Emma Carr, and the Weltys and the Wilsons were all in attendance at this historic meeting to organize their mining efforts. After 12 years of futility, Bob Womack's dream finally came true, and he was overwhelmed by the attention and praise he was given at this meeting. As the evening wore on, Bob drank more and more of Frank Costello's bourbon. All the attention embarrassed Bob, and he took another drink every time someone praised him. By the end of the evening, this humble cowboy who discovered the Cripple Creek Mining District was passed out on the floor in a drunken stupor. Winfield Scott Stratton was a 42-year-old carpenter when he arrived in Cripple Creek in May of 1891. He had spent the last 17 years prospecting throughout Colorado during the summer months, living on his savings from working as a carpenter during the winters in Colorado Springs. He estimated in 1890 that he had spent over $20,000 on his futile efforts to find gold and silver during those 17 years. It was a cynical and frustrated man who arrived in Cripple Creek to check out the mining district that his friend Bob Womack had talked so much about. Although Stratton had experienced bad luck over the years, he was probably one of the few prospectors in Cripple Creek at that time that actually knew plenty about mining. He had taken Professor Lamb's geology class at Colorado College and believed that gold would probably be found on the edge of this ancient volcanic crater. Wanting to get away from the tenderfeet that were looking for gold near Bob Womack's claim, he decided to concentrate his efforts on Battle Mountain, a location 3 miles southeast of Cripple Creek, near where the town of Victor now stands. At the foot of Battle Mountain, on July 4, 1891, Stratton staked his first claim and called his discovery the Independence Mine in honor of the July 4th date. That was the beginning of one of the greatest mining fortunes ever to be acquired in the early West. In 1884, the Womack family decided to sell the original Welty homestead so that Bob's brother William and William's wife Ida could return to Kentucky. Life at 10,000 feet was too much for Ida Womack, and they sold the homestead for $5,000 to a family of furniture dealers in Denver named Thompson. The ranch changed hands a couple of times and was finally purchased by 2 real estate businessmen in Denver, Horace Bennett and Julius Myers. Bennett and Myers hired a cattleman from Garden City by the name of George Carr to run their ranch. The ranch was now called the Hausman Cattle and Land Company, but George Carr gave it the unofficial title of the Broken Box Ranch. During the time the ranch changed hands, Bob Womack remained in the Cripple Creek area, continuing his search for gold. Cripple Creek first started as a tale of 2 cities. Hayden Placer, commonly known as Cripple Creek, was the hilly property northeast of the current town that Edward de la Verne had founded. Fremont, the current site of Cripple Creek, was platted by Bennett and Myers, who used their own names to identify the 2 main streets. The 2 adjoining towns did not last long, because in February of 1892, the citizens voted to combine them, creating what is currently known as the City of Cripple Creek. Hard rock mining in the 1890s was very expensive, dangerous, and labor-intensive. For 2 years, Stratton worked his mines, but he had very little to show for his efforts after he paid his expenses. He became frustrated with Cripple Creek and decided to put his mines up for sale. L.M. Perlman offered Stratton a lucrative offer for his Independence mine. He would pay Stratton a $5,000 option and an additional $150,000 if Perlman decided to purchase the Independence before a 30-day option expired. Stratton agreed, and while he was removing his equipment from the Independence mine, he accidentally discovered a rich vein of ore in a forgotten crosscut. He secretly had a sample examined and had assayed for $380 a ton. Stratton knew this vein would be worth at least $3 million and could only hope that Perlman's men wouldn't look in this remote crosscut before the option ran out. So the waiting began, and for 30 days, Stratton prayed Perlman wouldn't discover his secret. Near the end of the option period, Perlman asked Stratton to meet him at the Palace Hotel in Cripple Creek to talk. He complained to Stratton that his men didn't find enough to cover his $5,000 option for the Independence mine, and asked Stratton if he was willing to take back his option. Like a good poker player, Stratton kept a straight face and told Perlman to throw the option on the fire. Stratton would eventually sell the Independence mine for $11 million, and he became one of the richest mining men in the world. As soon as gold was discovered in Cripple Creek, it became obvious that an inexpensive way to ship the ore to the refineries in Colorado Springs was needed. A race began to see who could be the first to build a railroad to Cripple Creek. The Florence and Cripple Creek Railroad was built from the south up the scenic Phantom Canyon. This route was a difficult 40 miles with a steep climb that could only accommodate a smaller, narrow-gauge train. Despite the difficult task of building this railroad, the Florence and Cripple Creek was the first train line to make it to the mining district on July 1, 1894. Unfortunately, on the return trip, the train derailed and one man was killed. The Florence and Cripple Creek operated as a profitable line for the next 18 years. After a flash flood destroyed several bridges and 10 miles of railroad track, the line was permanently closed in 1912. The Colorado Midland Railroad already had a rail line to divide in 1894 when they decided to build an extension to Cripple Creek. They had the advantage of being able to use the larger standard gauge tracks. On July 4, 1894, 3 days after the Florence and Cripple Creek Railroad reached the mining district, the Midland Terminal steamed into Cripple Creek. The Midland Terminal was immediately a financial success since it offered the larger standard gauge railroad cars for hauling ore. The Midland Terminal continued to operate as a freight line until 1949. In April of 1901, the Colorado Springs and Cripple Creek District Railroad was the third railroad to reach Cripple Creek, popularly known as the Short Line because it traveled the shortest route of only 46 miles from Colorado Springs. The standard gauge railroad traveled up what is now known as Gold Camp Road. The most scenic of these three train routes, Teddy Roosevelt praised the Short Line and said its beauty bankrupt the English language. Most of the people who inhabited Cripple Creek at the turn of the century were not millionaires, but hard rock miners who did this hazardous work for $3 a day. An excellent working wage for the time, their high wage was offset by the fact they risked their lives in the mines. Before the gold discovery in Cripple Creek, Colorado had been primarily a silver mining state, and the silver mines in towns like Leadville employed thousands of miners. After silver prices dropped, these miners were suddenly out of work, and they looked to Cripple Creek for employment. With a glut of labor to work in the mines, the mine owners decided to increase the workday to 9 hours for the same amount of pay. This started 2 years of labor strife, which pitted the populist Governor David Waite, who was sympathetic to the miners' cause, against the conservative mine owners and Republicans of El Paso County. 700 of the striking miners took over Bull Hill, and Governor Waite sent a militia force to supposedly end the strike. However, Governor Waite only sent a paper tiger militia. because he had no intention of interfering with the miners, with whom he was sympathetic. The mine owners were outraged, and El Paso County Sheriff Frank Bauer deputized 1,200 men to take back Bull Hill. After arriving in Cripple Creek, these deputies retreated after being shot at by the strikers, who had the higher ground and the advantage in the so-called Battle of Bull Hill. On June 10, 1894, the mine owners gave in to the strikers' demands, and the 8-hour day was restored. This was the beginning of 8 years of relative labor peace and the golden era of Cripple Creek. If you had visited Cripple Creek between 1894 and 1902, you would have seen this gold town in its prime. Around 50,000 people lived in the Cripple Creek Mining District during that era. 35,000 people in the town of Cripple Creek, which made it the 4th largest city in Colorado. The 7 adjoining boom towns included the towns of Victor, Gillette, Altman, Independence, Goldfield, Elkton, and Cameron. They were all connected by a modern light rail system. Many people came through Cripple Creek to attempt to make their fortune. Future heavyweight champions Jack Johnson and Jack Dempsey spent time in Cripple Creek. Jack Johnson as a bouncer and club fighter, and Jack Dempsey as a mucker in the mines, and later as a fighter who fought under the name of Kid Blackie in Cripple Creek at the beginning of his career. Cowboy film star Tom Mix, comic actor Groucho Marx, future Colorado Governor Ralph Carr, Teddy Roosevelt, and William Jennings Bryan all passed through Cripple Creek during its golden era. During the boom, there were 150 saloons in the Cripple Creek Mining District, 49 grocery stores, 12 casinos, 34 churches, 118 teachers, 90 doctors, 15 newspapers, 9 assay offices, 10 barbershops, 72 lawyers, and 300 prostitutes. An interesting aspect of life as a miner in Cripple Creek was how everyone supplemented their income through high grading. High grading was stealing rich gold ore from the mines and having that gold milled through both legitimate and bootleg milling operations. A miner or foreman could supplement his income as much as 1/3 through high grading, and it was an accepted practice in Cripple Creek by even the most law-abiding citizens. Rich gold ore could even be found in the collection plates of the various churches. An estimated $1 to $2 million of ore per year was stolen from those early Cripple Creek mines through high grading. Entertainment was at a premium in Cripple Creek, and the miners spent their money freely on amusement. From boxing matches to opera, every type of entertainment was available in Cripple Creek during its golden era. The Grand Opera House on Myers Avenue could seat 1,200 people and was the site of the world's first indoor rodeo. Every major entertainment show in the country eventually came through Cripple Creek. One of the most unusual events to take place in the mining district was the first and only bullfight in the United States. Staged in Gillette by conman Joe Wolf, the bullfight was almost stopped by the local Humane Society. Despite the opposition, the bullfight took place on Saturday, August 24, 1895. 5 days later, Joe Wolf and his business acquaintance were arrested for cruelty to animals, and they were taken to the El Paso County Jail. With open flames, common before electricity, the shabbily built homes and businesses of this boom town were tinderboxes. On Saturday morning, April 25, 1896, the first fire to incinerate Cripple Creek fittingly began on Myers Avenue. The fire started as a result of a dispute between a bartender and his prostitute girlfriend on the second floor of the Central Dance Hall on Myers Avenue. Their struggle resulted in a lighted oil lamp being thrown by a window, which set fire to the curtains. Most of the buildings on Myers Avenue burned to the ground before the fire was finally put out. On the following Wednesday, April 29th, a second fire broke out, when a cook at the Portland Hotel spilled a kettle of grease on a hot stove. This fire traveled from 2nd and Myers to Bennett Avenue, and 1/3 of Cripple Creek burned to the ground. When word reached Colorado Springs, Winfield Scott Stratton and the citizens of Colorado Springs generously responded. A shipment of clothing, tents, and supplies were sent on a special train on the Midland Line. In some ways, the fire was a blessing in disguise. The town was rebuilt, and this time they used brick and better construction methods. Many of these new buildings still stand today on Bennett Avenue. With more than 8,000 hard rock miners living in Cripple Creek during its golden era, and most of them making what was considered a good wage of $3 a day, it's not surprising that the town attracted a small army of sporting ladies who set up their businesses on Myers Avenue. One of the most notorious tenderloin districts of the early West, almost anything was legal on Myers Avenue. If you were to walk down the street in this modern Gomorrah, you would have found over 300 prostitutes, 20 houses of ill repute, dozens of one-room cribs, and several opium dens. If you were discreet, you could get almost any drug imaginable at a Cripple Creek pharmacy, including morphine, the drug of choice for most of these women of the half-world. Not only was prostitution allowed to flourish until the 1920s, but it was actually taxed by the City of Cripple Creek at a rate of $6 a month for each girl and $16 a month for each madam. From the wealthiest millionaire to the humblest $3 a day hard rock miner, all walks of life could be found patronizing the businesses of Myers Avenue. The life of a miner was precarious and brutal, and most of these young men worked hard in the mines and then played hard on Myers Avenue. One of the most famous sporting ladies of Myers Avenue was Pearl DeVere, the madam at the infamous old Homestead House. A beautiful redhead with a silky white complexion, Pearl DeVere captured the imagination of most of the men in Cripple Creek. The old Homestead House was a high-class house of prostitution whose women would charge, at that time, upwards of $250 a night. It was frequented by only the wealthiest mine owners and businessmen of Cripple Creek, and was a very modern house for the time, with electric lights, running water, a telephone, and an intercom system. One unique aspect of the old Homestead House was a viewing room where a man could discreetly choose his companion for the night. One afternoon, Pearl DeVere excused herself to her room and took a fatal overdose of morphine. Since Pearl left no suicide note, no one has ever been able to determine if it was an accidental overdose or a deliberate suicide.
And the sister come to claim the body, thinking that she had been running a millinery shop in the West, making hats. But when she looked at the death certificate and saw that she was listed as a prostitute, she had absolutely nothing to do with Pearl. Got on the train, went back to Chicago. This really upset the girls off the avenue here, and some of the miners too, because as I told you, she was very good to these people. They said they would take care of Pearl, and they started making all the arrangements. They had all the bands they could get and all the wagons and surreys and a small collection when a letter come through the mail. And it said to bury her in this beautiful gown, and there was a check for $1,000. She had one of the most elaborate funerals ever had here in Cripple Creek. She is the only one of this kind of a woman that is buried in the cemetery with a marker to her grave. And the bands were all real nice. They played all the appropriate funeral marches going out. They even played Goodbye, Little Girl, Goodbye. But coming back in, their sorrow was short-lived because they struck up very loudly. There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight.
The second old Homestead House, built after the fire in 1896, still stands on Myers Avenue and is now a museum celebrating that unique time. In a town filled with tough, hard rock miners who were quick to use their fist, maybe the toughest man to ever pass through Cripple Creek was a Harvard graduate by the name of Spencer Penrose. Spencer Penrose, Speck to his friends, was the son of a prominent physician in Philadelphia and left a privileged life to make his fortune in the Wild West. Along the way, he set about proving to the world that his blue blood was as red as any man's. Not one to shy away from a fistfight, young Spencer Penrose was a dashing figure. Arriving in Colorado in his mid-20s, Spencer Penrose was the most eligible bachelor in Cripple Creek, and he happily lived up to his reputation as a ladies' man. A skilled horseman and a brilliant businessman, Spencer Penrose was a great man of vision, whose wealth continues to benefit the state of Colorado through the El Pomar Foundation. His boyhood friend, Charles Tutt, was a real estate man in Colorado Springs and was responsible for inviting Penrose to the Pikes Peak region. They became partners in several real estate ventures and had a joint interest in the COD mine at Cripple Creek. It was the start of a long professional and personal relationship between Spencer Penrose and the Tutt family that has lasted several generations. Although Speck had no children of his own, the Tutt family has continued his legacy through their involvement with the Broadmoor Hotel and the El Pomar Foundation. But it wasn't Cripple Creek gold that made the fortune of Spencer Penrose. It was his investment in Utah copper mines that made him a multimillionaire. With his mining wealth, he built the Broadmoor Hotel in 1919, and eventually, with his wife Julie Penrose, created the El Pomar Foundation. Each year, the El Pomar Foundation awards millions of dollars to deserving Colorado-based nonprofit organizations and is the single largest private foundation in Colorado. Although the sporting ladies of that era have received most of the attention in the Cripple Creek history books, the truth is that the vast majority of women in Cripple Creek during that time period were hard-working, God-fearing, respectable Western women. In fact, several Cripple Creek women have received recognition for being pioneers in changing traditional roles for women. One of the first female attorneys in the country practiced law in Cripple Creek early in her career. Daisy Barbie, the second cousin of Cripple Creek historian Mabel Barbie Lee, defended the poor and often represented the abused women of Myers Avenue. In one celebrated case, she successfully fought for the rights of Myers Avenue prostitute Blanche LaCroix to keep her baby. Molly O'Brien arrived in Cripple Creek as a stenographer in 1893. A shrewd businesswoman, Molly eventually became one of the wealthiest women in Colorado and owned several gold mining companies by the early 1900s. She was the first woman in Colorado to have an official seat on the gold mining stock exchange. Dr. Susan Anderson, or Doc Susie as she was known, was one of the first female physicians in Colorado. The television show Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, is loosely based on Doc Susie's life as a country physician in the early West. Susie arrived in Cripple Creek with her father and brother as a young woman of 22 in 1892. Her father was a successful Cripple Creek businessman and sent Susie to the University of Michigan to go to medical school. She returned to Cripple Creek as a physician in 1897 and opened up her first practice. When her beloved brother died of influenza in 1900, she left Cripple Creek and became a well-respected country doctor in Grand County, Colorado. When she died in 1960, at the age of 90, her wish was to be buried next to her brother in Cripple Creek's Mount Pisgah Cemetery. Unable to locate her brother's grave, they buried Doc Susie in a different section of the cemetery. Years later, the citizens of Grand County finally located her brother's gravesite. Rather than exhume her body, they paid for a second gravestone to honor Doc Susie and placed it by her brother's grave. Dr. Susan Anderson has the unique distinction of being the only person in the Mount Pisgah Cemetery to have two gravestones. Molly Kathleen Gortner discovered the Molly Kathleen gold mine in September of 1891. She became the first woman in history to register a mining claim in her own name.
She went down to sign the papers, and they said, well, you can't do this, you're a woman. You'll have to have somebody else sign this. And she hurried up and grabbed the papers and signed it and said, now, you argue with my husband when he gets back. And by doing that, she became the first woman in history to strike a gold claim in a woman's name. So she was pretty quick. However, she couldn't hire anybody. The men would not go to work for her because, well, there again, she was a woman. So she got her son to manage the mine, and he actually managed it clear up until 1949 when he died. However, Molly, she just, every time she came onto the property, the men would come out from underground because of the superstition, and they'd wait until she left, and then they'd go back to work. Of course, she just smiled all the way to the bank. You know, that didn't bother her a bit.
The Molly Kathleen Gold Mine is the only remaining underground gold mine in the area and has been operating continuously since 1891. Now a tourist attraction, visitors to Cripple Creek can experience the life of a hard rock miner and travel 1,000 feet underground on this remarkable tour. The Molly Kathleen Gold Mine is a living monument to one of the most amazing women to ever work and live in the Cripple Creek Mining District. The beginning of the end of the golden era of Cripple Creek began with the death of Winfield Scott Stratton on September 14, 1902. Stratton was not a content person before finding his great fortune, but ironically, his wealth seemed to make him an even unhappier man. The people he cared about, including two of his partners, Jimmy Doyle and Jimmy Burns, let great wealth interfere with their friendship. Burns eventually sued Doyle, and Doyle claimed Burns tried to kill him. This greediness and fighting just made Stratton more depressed, and he turned to whiskey for relief. Where Stratton did find some contentment was through his generosity to working people. Since Stratton spent most of his adult life as a carpenter, he was extremely generous to common working people. He bought a bicycle for every laundry woman in Colorado Springs to make their jobs easier, and he built a modern streetcar system in Colorado Springs. He was a soft touch for any miner that approached him for a grub stake. But his great wealth was a burden, and he spent most of his time protecting his wealth from lawsuits. In a letter to a friend, he wrote how he regretted not taking the $150,000 option for his Independence mine. He felt that he would have been much happier with a smaller fortune to manage. Although the official cause of his death was cirrhosis of the liver, Stratton actually died from his alcohol addiction at the age of 54. In a final act of great generosity to the common man, Stratton left the bulk of his fortune to the Myron Stratton Home, which was named in honor of his father. This non-profit charity, still operating today, was created to benefit indigent children and the elderly people of El Paso County. But even in death, Stratton had to fight off the attorneys. Several lawsuits and liens were filed against his estate, and it took nearly 15 years of litigation to clear up the mess. Despite the bittersweet life of Winfield Scott Stratton, he will go down in history as one of the most important men of his era, and certainly one of the most generous men of this region.
I love the story about Stratton's testimonial dinner. He was the first citizen of Colorado Springs. No one had money that could match that of Winfield Scott Stratton. And so the city decided that it was high time that they paid him some kind of an honor. And the night was set and the banquet was arranged at the Old Antlers Hotel. And came time and Stratton said, "I'm not going." That's all there was to it. He didn't want any attention. He just did these things because his heart told him to do them. He didn't care about the fame or the credit. He just did it.
Buried in the Evergreen Cemetery in Colorado Springs, the inscription on his gravestone reads, "'Tis not enough to help the feeble up, but to support him after." The biography of Winfield Scott Stratton's life is beautifully written in Frank Waters' book, The Midas of the Rockies. With the death of Stratton, the peace between the unions and the mine owners ended. A second labor war started in August of 1903. The politics in Colorado had changed, and now conservative Republican Governor James Peabody was in office. After 9 union men were fired from a non-union refinery, Big Bill Haywood, executive secretary of the Western Federation of Miners, called a strike. Haywood was a socialist who was willing to use any means necessary to beat the mine owners, even if it meant resorting to terrorism. On June 5, 1904, Haywood engineered the blowing up of a train platform filled with non-union workers. 13 men were killed instantly, and 20 men were badly injured. After the bloodbath, any public sympathy for the union was lost. Governor Peabody finally had both public support and the mine owners' money to help him get rid of the Western Federation of Miners. Governor Peabody declared martial law and suspended due process. He sent in the militia and rounded up the loyal WFM members and herded them into bullpens. Around 300 of the union miners were put in boxcars at gunpoint and abandoned in the prairies of eastern Colorado, as well as the Kansas and New Mexico borders. 200 other union men were imprisoned. Those who were lucky enough to escape fled into the mountains. By the end of the summer, the union was non-existent in Cripple Creek. The mine owners had won with the help of the governor, and the non-union workers agreed to work a 9-hour day for $3. 33 men on both sides were killed during the union unrest, and Cripple Creek was never the same. Bob Womack's problem with alcohol cost him his fortune. He sold his share of the Womack placer for $500 so he could pay for his alcohol addiction. At age 50, worn down from his drinking, Bob watched his friends become richer and richer, while the man who discovered Cripple Creek gold had nothing to show for it. By 1894, he had left Cripple Creek for good to live with his sister Lida in her boarding house in Colorado Springs. Her influence convinced him to take the cure for alcohol abuse, and he never drank again. For the next 10 years, Bob worked as a cook for his sister, and he enjoyed a quiet life surrounded by his family. Although Bob lived in relative obscurity in Colorado Springs, the city of Cripple Creek had not forgotten his contribution. In 1902, Bob took the short line to Cripple Creek as the invited guest of honor for the 4th of July parade. As he sat on the grand float, Bob waved proudly as the town of Cripple Creek applauded him in this final gesture of respect for discovering the world's greatest gold camp. It was Bob's last hurrah, and the respect and praise from the town of Cripple Creek meant more to him than any fortune he might have lost.
He might not have had a really good business head on his shoulders, but I always admired Bob Womack. He stuck with what he believed in until he found it, and look what happened. 27 millionaires and 2 huge communities and years and years of great prosperity for a lot of people. He opened the door to a real treasure chest.
2 years later, in 1904, Bob had a stroke, and he lived with his sister as an invalid for the next 5 years. On August 10th, 1909, Bob Womack died at the age of 66. It was a sad ending for this remarkable cowboy who spent 14 years of his life trying to convince the people of Colorado Springs there was gold on the southwest side of Pikes Peak. Right after World War II, the population of Cripple Creek had dropped to less than 1,000, and gold production had gone from a high of $18 million a year to only $200,000. Cripple Creek was at a crossroads, and the city looked desperately for another way besides mining to survive. So the city turned to its storytellers to help revive an interest in its history and to promote Cripple Creek as a tourist destination. In 1946, Dorothy and Wayne Mackin bought the Imperial Hotel and went about the hard work of restoring it. They had the vision and energy to promote tourism and produced a classic melodrama in the Gold Bar Theater. The first year, more than 4,500 people drove up to enjoy this unique entertainment, and the Mackins continued this very successful tradition of the melodrama for almost 50 years. But in the early 1950s, the Mackins had a financial setback, and they faced the real possibility of closing their Imperial Hotel for good. Unable to get a bank loan to save their business, the Mackins turned to the Myron Stratton home for help. 50 years after his death, just like he had done after the fires, Winfield Scott Stratton saved the town of Cripple Creek again by grub-staking the Mackins. In 1953, nationally known historian Marshall Sprague published Money Mountain, a definitive history of Cripple Creek. Money Mountain helped launch a renewed interest in the legacy of the mining district, and almost 50 years later, it is still considered the Bible on the history of Cripple Creek. International journalist Lowell Thomas, the son of a Victor physician, was a strong proponent of the Cripple Creek Mining District. He began his journalism career at the Victor Daily Record, and he eventually became one of the most respected journalists of his time.
Well, I'm an enthusiast for all mining camps, but of course particularly for my own hometown. Because when I was a boy, the Cripple Creek District was regarded as the greatest gold camp in the world. I imagine its only rival in those days was the great camp at Johannesburg on the Transvaal. But anyhow, the miners took some $800 million out of these mountains right here in the Cripple Creek District. I worked in the mines as a boy. I started working when I was, about 13 years old, I guess, or maybe earlier than that. The first mine I worked on was called the Tornado, and I worked in a tremendous stope where rocks were falling down constantly, and I was very, very glad to get out of that damn stope.
In 1958, Cripple Creek historian Mabel Barbie Lee published her first book entitled Cripple Creek Days. Arriving in Cripple Creek as a young girl with her mother on a stagecoach in 1892, she tells the tale of how her stagecoach was robbed by gentlemen bandits who ended up giving her a silver dollar. A graduate of Colorado College, Mabel Barbie Lee returned to the town of Victor as a teacher and included among her students a young Lowell Thomas. In 1953, the original Midland Terminal Depot was converted into the Cripple Creek District Museum. The Cripple Creek District Museum contains an extensive collection of photographs and artifacts that preserve and celebrate the history of Cripple Creek. In the 1960s, Cripple Creek newspaper publisher and mayor Bill Robinson started the tradition of the Aspen Jeep Tours. The popular Aspen Tours allow people to experience the history of the mining district while enjoying the beautiful aspen turning in the fall. Later in the 60s, the Cripple Creek and Victor Narrow Gauge Railroad was established to let tourists step back in time and enjoy Cripple Creek's railroad legacy. The hard rock miner's best friend, the donkey, has always run free in Cripple Creek. The 2 Mile High Club manages and cares for the town's wandering herd, and they sponsor the popular Donkey Derby Days. This annual competition in June is a comical and always entertaining race down Bennett Avenue. Because of the many wonderful storytellers and unique Cripple Creek traditions, the mining district was able to survive the tough times after the gold rush. With gold prices rising in the 1970s and 1980s, a second boom in gold mining began in Victor. The old mines were revitalized, and open pit mining replaced the more dangerous underground hard rock mining. It is believed that there is still more gold in the ground than was ever taken out of Cripple Creek in the past.
I have an opinion based mainly upon the people that know a lot more than I do. The old mine owners, the old mining engineers, geologists, and maybe more important than any of them, the good, sharp miners that used to work here. There's a consensus of opinion among all these people that 80% of the gold was left in the ground. Now the big mining company with the open pit is trying hard to reduce that 80%, but there's still, most of it is still there.
Because of the demand for this precious mineral, the Cripple Creek and Victor Gold Mining Company is now the largest employer in Teller County.
Well, Cripple Creek and Victor Gold Mining Company currently employs about 288 individuals. About 66% of those live in the Teller County area, and they actually have an annual payroll in Teller County alone of about $11.2 million. We are the largest private employer in Teller County. Statewide, we have an annual payroll of about $18.2 million.
In 1991, almost 100 years after the city of Cripple Creek was incorporated, a second gold rush began. This time, it was limited stakes gambling. In October of 1991, the voters of Colorado approved limited stakes gambling for some of Colorado's economically depressed mining towns. Cripple Creek, Black Hawk, and Central City revived their economies with plenty of jobs and new revenue from gambling. Many of the original Cripple Creek buildings were renovated, and thousands of tourists now visit this historic community each year. On a busy summer day, Bennett Avenue is teeming with people, just as it was over 100 years ago.
Well, my feelings are that these people that come up here primarily are right now here for gaming. But what we would like to think is that we can diversify that economy and branch out and attract more of the families back up here like we used to and complement the gambling with that, and that we can get a good diversity of people up here to enjoy our city like we enjoy it.
To honor the man who discovered Cripple Creek, a statue of Bob Womack was erected in 1993. This tribute to the cowboy has him looking down Bennett Avenue at the town he discovered. Bob would be proud to know that Cripple Creek is a thriving community again, with a strong economy from gold mining, gambling, and tourism. The mining district he discovered resulted in the fortunes of great men like Winfield Scott Stratton, Spencer Penrose, and Charles Tutt, men whose fortunes are still helping the entire state of Colorado. The Broadmoor Hotel, Penrose Hospital, the Myron Stratton Home, Colorado College, and the many nonprofit organizations that have been funded through the El Pomar Foundation all owe their success in part to Cripple Creek Gold. And even today, when you talk to an old-timer, you can hear in their voice that gold fever is still alive and well in Cripple Creek.
All of the roads and railroads that were built in Colorado were to go to mines, to mining areas. So it developed the state. It made this state just blossom out all at once because of the mining. Otherwise, it would have been years and years before there would have been much settling in the state of Colorado. So it's extremely important to Colorado and to the nation, because you have to have mining in order to exist. Modern day living has to have things from the ground. You either grow it or else you mine it.
Until 1949, life in Cripple Creek revolved around train service in and out of the district. In 1929, 18-year-old Colorado City resident Ira Current bought one of the first 16mm cameras. With his hand-crank silent camera, Ira Current decided to capture history. His film is now one of the most remarkable motion picture archives of the mining district. A lifetime photographer now in his 90s, Ira Current talked about his amazing day on the Midland.
Tell us about the day you went up to Cripple Creek. Why did you decide to do this film? And
Oh, I just figured it ought to be done. Be a nice trip, yeah. And I just wanted to make a picture of it. Shot another series, you've got that too, I guess, of the freight train going up Ute Pass.
what do you remember from that day? You had the tripod, the camera, and one
That's
thing
right.
that I've always was impressed by your films is your camera angles. You're always looking for something different, mounting at different locations.
Well,
And what do you
well,
remember from that day?
Well, first, with that camera, the finders are very nice to use. I mean, it had one on top and one in back, so you could actually see what you're doing very well. The trouble with maybe shooting out of the side of the train, going around curves, is getting the camera mounted on the tripod. And I had to lean the tripod over the edge of the observation car of the train, and then tilt the head and turn the camera sideways so that it would be square, and then do my cranking there without knocking it over or having it fall off or something like that.
And how much was it to take the Midland at that time to Cripple Creek? Do you
Well,
remember?
I think it was under $5. I believe it was maybe 2.5, but I may be wrong.
Was it still a pretty wild town, or was it?
It was sort of dying down after the gold sort of petered out. But there was, as you saw in that picture, an old prospector. I wanted to be set up earlier to get him walking towards the camera, but I only got him as he came around the corner and put his pickaxe down. I thought that was kind of nice.
In 1966, veteran television producer Bob Fitzmaurice took a primitive 16mm optical camera to Cripple Creek and interviewed some of the people who helped make the district famous. Cripple Creek's mayor Bill Robinson, international journalist Lowell Thomas, historians Marshall Sprague and Mabel Barbie Lee sat down at the Imperial Hotel to talk about their experiences and love for the mining district.
Representing the new life of Cripple Creek, Bill Robinson, who is not one of the old-timers here, although I think Bill knows probably just as much about the district as anybody who's lived here for a long time. Bill came here originally as publisher of the Cripple Creek Gold Rush, and Bill, I understand your son is now publisher of the paper.
That's right.
You've been here since, what was it, 1960?
1960, Mark.
What brought you out to Cripple Creek?
Oh, desire to live in an old-time mining camp, I guess.
And like so many people, you had relatives that lived here at one time.
That's true, back in the 90s.
When your grandfather came here?
Yes, sir. My grandfather's in the livery business in Cripple Creek in the 90s.
So not everybody was in the mining business in this area. Bill, as I mentioned, you're kind of the new life of Cripple Creek. It's often thought of as a ghost town, an old mining town with nothing left. But there is a new life, as we mentioned, and this is tourism. What do you think of it?
I think right at the moment, as long as the government has their unrealistic approach to gold mining, that tourism is the only hopes for Cripple Creek. This is an old mining town, but as you mentioned, we have plenty of life. I think a person could spend his entire vacation in the Cripple Creek Mining District and find plenty to do.
What I would consider one of the most entertaining and factual historical accounts of the Cripple Creek District, coming right from the time when they first ran cattle up in here, right up to the present time. It's called Money Mountain, the author of which is Marshall Sprague. And Marshall, I unfortunately just finished the book. I say unfortunately because many other people have read it before I ever got to it, and it certainly is a very interesting book. How long does it take to research a book such as Money Mountain?
I think I took about 2 years on that job. It was the first book of this region that I'd written, and I was pretty much in the dark about how it should be planned and so on. And so I got up there in Colorado College Library and read the Gazette. It's practically a rewrite of the Gazette through the years that Cripple Creek was booming at its highest.
What prompted you to do a book on Cripple
Well,
Creek in the district?
and it just seemed to me that people were so interested in this fantastic gold camp, which is quite almost in a class by itself in the history of world gold rushes, because it was so small and so much gold came out of such a small area.
This young lady is well known for a couple of reasons. She's one of the foremost authors concerning the Cripple Creek Mining District, and she was also Lowell Thomas's school teacher way back when. Mabel Barbie Lee. And Mrs. Lee, what grades did you teach Lowell Thomas at?
I taught him, or tried to teach him, history and Spanish. He knew much more history than I did. And I was always very much afraid he was going to ask me a question I couldn't answer.
This would have been somewhat embarrassing.
But I knew more Spanish than he did. And even today I notice now that when he speaks of it, he says that he studied Spanish with me. He doesn't say he studied history with me, and there's a good reason why.
He's been studying history ever since,
Yes.
hasn't he?
Well, his father was a very brilliant scholar, and I think Lowell studied with his father a great deal at home. And it put him ahead in school, you see, and handicapped poor little school teachers like me.
Probably one of the most well-known exponents of the Cripple Creek Mining District, a man who grew up in the mining district and lived a good portion of his life over in Victor, and actually got a start in the journalism business in Victor. That's Mr. Lowell Thomas. And Lowell, you've always been one that's been quite a plugger of the Cripple Creek Mining District, have you not?
Well, I'm an enthusiast for all mining camps, but of course particularly for my own hometown. Because when I was a boy, the Cripple Creek District was regarded as the greatest gold camp in the world. I imagine its only rival in those days was the great camp at Johannesburg on the Transvaal. But these mines here, they're all around us. We're sitting in the Imperial Hotel in Cripple Creek at the moment. And I come back to the Cripple Creek District, to Victor, and to its suburb, Cripple Creek, as often as I can, every 2 or 3 years. And this time, I'm here, sort of playing host to a group of people who've been getting together every summer for, 50 years or so. Because the people who worked in the mines here in the Cripple Creek District, they seem to almost belong to a club. And they enjoy coming back and trying to relive the old days. Alas, alas. So far, I've been up here for 2 hours this morning already, and so far, I haven't met a single one, Hardrock, who goes back to the days when I was here. None of my vintage. So you see, I've become a patriarch. At any rate, it's great fun to come back and to come to the Imperial Hotel, the home of melodrama, where the first Western melodrama was put on, that is, in what we call modern times, this jet age. And so long until tomorrow.
Thank you.